So I'm talking today as a lab scientist, right? So I run a lab at Rice that looks at both brain health problems. I study language and cognition loss after stroke, but also brain skills problems. So I study how kids learn how to read with a particular focus on blind kids. That's sort of the narrowness that scientists tend to operate in, but it also gives me some space to think about how to connect these notions of brain economy and brain capital to research communities. And of course, as Harris said, I'm not speaking from my role at the National Science Foundation, but certainly the last few years that I've worked as a federal funder has given me a sense of what the research landscape looks like. So I can sort of think about how to fit in where researchers actually are. And so this is very much towards a research strategy. This is hopefully the start of a conversation. There are many experts in this room who are doing active and excellent research in various aspects of brain health and brain skills, who have lots of really fantastic ideas about what we ought to be doing in this space. Of course, there's tons of, this represents a tiny fraction of the neuroscience community. The Society for Neuroscience is the world's largest conference. Every year, 30,000 people gather in some of the world's largest convention centers to be able to talk about advances that are being made in neuroscience research. There's interest in understanding the brain, but of course the interest is in using that understanding of the brain to improve lives in society. So there is a large and robust scientific community that can be marshaled towards these efforts. But science is slow, science is iterative. The communities that study the brain are pretty disconnected from each other. And there's a few frameworks that I've sort of heard mentioned here that sort of dominate the way that we think about the paths to societal impact. So not research on prevention, but research towards cures, research on animal models, not research on people, sort of a bench to bedside model of pharmaceutical development still is the dominant way that we tend to study neuroscience. And because of that, there's also tons of questions of scalability. And there's tons of interest in trying to think about different kinds of intervention and how we might be able to compare across the modes of intervention. When scientists study an intervention, they typically look to see if there's a significant improvement, even if it's 1%. If it's significant, we're very happy with what we've accomplished, but not necessarily thinking about the number of people whose lives will be impacted and what it would mean to scale that intervention to a whole society. So that's the background that I think we should be talking about as we think about what a brain capital or brain economy research strategy should look like. So the questions are, can brain economy and brain capital organize existing research programs? Can we marshal those 30,000 neuroscientists and the many, many other behavioral scientists and social scientists whose work is also super relevant in this space? Can we marshal them together towards a common goal? What are the kinds of science that are missing for us to be able to accomplish this goal? And so today I just want to lay out where I think some of the scientific problems are that need to be solved, that we can start to think about what such a strategy could look like. And so the first scientific problem is the scientific problem of measurement. So I've listened to a lot of your talks today, I've been in a lot of meetings with Harris around brain capital. And I think it's a fantastic concept. I think it pulls a lot of things together, but it also can be sort of undefined exactly what contributes to brain capital. And so the measurement problem that we have to solve is to really think about what do we mean by brain capital? What are the contributing bits that make up what we think of as brain capital? So we hear, for example, in documents that I read, we see that we want to increase brain skills. There's certain skills that can identify that we think are implicitly linked to what we think brain capital is. When we talk about brain health, we're sort of talking about a set of things that, because of brain disorders, people don't have anymore that we think are really critical for brain capital. Sometimes these get enumerated, so we see cognition, decision-making, emotion regulation, resilience, learning agility, emotional intelligence, all these things get put together to say, these are probably the bits that make up brain capital. But we have to think about how we actually examine that scientifically, how we test the question of whether these things are actually contributing to brain capital. These are what we might call, from a psychometrics perspective, constructs, but they're just the things that we have that we think we can measure that contribute to brain capital. And then we have tons and tons of ways of measuring those things, right? So we have wearable devices that are taking, all sorts of measurements from us continuously. More likely, we have surveys or various types of instruments, to go back to this idea that even though we're developing stuff in the lab, that actually people go to the clinic and get the mini mental. We have new AI tools that are probably going to transform the ways that we're able to assess some of these constructs. And we also have ways of measuring the brain as it's doing various processes. The questions that we have to ask are, or the work that we have to do here, is we have to develop and evaluate the way that we might measure these factors that are hypothesized to influence brain capital. How do we go from sort of these constructs to thinking about what it is that we're actually measuring in the real world? These things are interrelated with each other, and so we have to understand their relationship to each other. And then really critically, because this is a global effort, we really have to make sure that the measures are culturally appropriate, that they generalize and are usable in all sorts of different contexts. And so some people might want a gold standard panacea, a measure of cognition that it doesn't matter where you come from. And that might be possible, but alternatively, we might think about how we might measure cognition or various aspects of cognition in culturally specific ways as we think about looking at this as a worldwide effort. Okay, so the scientific problem, the second one that I think is really important, is modeling. And I think we can almost think of this as climate modeling, or something akin to the way that we've thought about climate modeling. So we have to think about these various factors and how they might contribute to something like brain capital, right? So we have to be able to evaluate whether individual factors are actually contributing. So we need to create we're going to do science here. And so science needs to have hypotheses that could be found to be incorrect. And so we can't just say creativity is critical for brain capital and leave it at that. We have to evaluate it. We have to do a scientific study. And so we can ask questions like, does our measure of leadership, for example, impact brain capital? Or maybe how much does each factor contribute? So if you get sort of 1 unit higher in creativity, what is the improvement in brain capital that we're going to see in the system? But also much more complicated interactions, right? So brain capital is something that we talk about at an individual level, right? A person's brain health is something that belongs to that person, but it's also something that in this room we talk about as an organizational or even societal level. Right, so how do the interaction between the people who have different components of brain health relate to each other? Is there something like a Gini coefficient, a measure of brain capital inequality that's going to be important for being able to measure what societal brain capital looks like? These are going to be more complicated modeling efforts. The first set of problems that I described are the things that scientists are actively working on: measurement, constructs. We have lots of people that do that type of work, and we can organize them around this goal. This becomes a set of new problems where we're going to need iterative science, starting from really simple models and refining over time to be able to develop what we mean by this. And the third problem is intervention, right? So what's very exciting about this type of conversation is the number of different kinds of intervention around brain capital that people are thinking about, right? So there's like neurotech, where people are, my colleagues at Rice are building really cool devices that are going to manipulate your brain so that you don't have depression anymore, and it's awesome. But there's also nutritional AI approaches that we heard about earlier today. There's also drug development. There's also large-scale behavioral interventions that are brain-inspired but not actually manipulating the brain. What we should be moving towards are ways of evaluating these interventions so that we can look at outcomes that we can relate back to our notion of brain capital. We can ask questions about who the research generalizes to. So, for example, if we haven't studied women in our research, as is the case, we can't say that we know that the intervention is going to generalize to women. And so we have to be honest about sort of who we know that these interventions are going to help, how long they're going to be effective for, what it will mean to scale, both in terms of cost and benefit, the obstacles to adoption. People don't always like technology when you just hand it to them. They need to be sort of acculturated and maybe have reasonable ideas about why they don't want to take some of this technology into their everyday lives. And also things like opportunity cost. When I teach an undergraduate course on memory, I talk about brain training games, which are an example of a place where there was a lot of excitement around technology with somewhat limited, at the time, scientific evidence for it. And I teach them about this case in Chicago where students were given brain training games in the place of recess, right? And so we have to think about what the benefits are of recess, of running around, of exercise, of social interaction, which we know have actually enormous and well-documented brain health benefits, against what they're doing instead, which is playing these games, which had, at least at that time, really minimal impact. And so we have to be able to evaluate all of these things, because our ultimate goal is to evaluate interventions based on the impact that they can have on brain capital. We need to build a science out that can get to the point where we can say, we will be able to, by perturbing the system, by doing this intervention, this is what we think the outcome is going to be on brain capital in some structure. Okay, so just to summarize, towards our research strategy, I think brain economy and brain capital becomes an organizing principle for neuroscience researchers to ask questions. It sort of poses this question: how should we allot resources? We've talked about organizational resources, but we can also talk about scientific resources, people, time, money, towards improving brain capital. It motivates the need for research on measurement for different brain skills, for the kinds of things that we're worried about that might be lost because of brain disorders or poor brain health. It motivates the need for research on different populations and culturally specific contexts. It creates brain capital as something to be modeled from these measurements, and it creates a way for us to evaluate interventions on a common scale, so we can start to ask questions where we say, let's talk about nutrition and brain stimulation sort of in the same conversation, where we can think about what the relative impact of these different approaches to improving brain health might be. And so we're working on that at Rice, and so there is going to be some Houston specificity to this. In March, Harris and I are going to be part of the launch of a brain institute at Rice. We're going to be co-leading a part that's going to be called Brain in Society, where the goal is to try to think about what this research strategy might look like. We're going to try to think about it at a really global level, sort of in conversations like this, but we're also going to try to think about it locally with the specific scientists that we have at Rice, economists who are working on how early childhood interventions can improve human capital, with industrial organizational psychologists who want to study interventions in the context of a workplace, and with a huge number of neuroscientists who are interested in thinking about how we might measure and manipulate brains in the context of these different things and study different disease states. And of course, we're very happy to be part of the general Houston milieu of taking the brain economy very seriously. Thank you very much.